Welcome to the Amazing Studios podcast. My name is Peter Scheibner.
And I'm Cliff Baumgarten.
Cliff, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing this week?
Good. Yeah, it's been a busy week. A lot going on here around the studio.
Yeah, quite a few shoots, quite a few things we have on the plate.
Yesterday was an interesting shoot.
Yeah, that was a long day.
It was a long day, but we made it. We survived. What are you doing this weekend?
Actually, it's pretty cool. I'm heading up to my family's lake place, and a lot of you guys from the studio are coming up.
It's gonna be fun.
Yeah,
Is Mike gonna bring the jet ski?
I think so.
I kind of hope so.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so we want to promo kind of our first segment today.
Right.
But before we do that, I've got a funny story I've got to share. I got to get this off my chest.
And he wouldn't tell me this before the podcast.
No,
so.
I needed him to hear this for the first time with everybody else who's listening. So last night, let me set the scene. My wife is 8 months pregnant.
Very pregnant.
Yes, very pregnant. And my daughter is 18 months old. And so a very light sleeper at this point. So we are pretty uptight about the doorbell. And we make sure if somebody's coming who would be delivering something, anything like that, they come before Kaylee goes down. We don't like it when the doorbell rings. Well, last night I'm sitting on my couch and the doorbell rings. And I think, dear Lord, who is ringing the doorbell? They're going to wake up my daughter. My wife even says the words, Peter, go upstairs and kill them. So I go up from our basement where we've been watching TV. And I go up, and there at the door is a pizza delivery man. I didn't order a pizza. And so I open the door, and he says, hello, I've got a pepperoni pizza, some wings, garlic knots, and a cookie. And I said, well, I didn't order a pizza. He said, well, it's paid for. And I said, but I didn't order a pizza. So he looks down, and he says, it says here, Steven Scheibner. Now, as you may have caught my name being Peter Scheibner, I am related to whoever ordered this pizza. In fact, it was my younger brother who lives 25 minutes away, who the last time he ordered a pizza was at my house. And he completely forgot to change the address. And so the pizza got delivered to my house for him.
25 miles away.
Fortunately, here at the studio, we have an intern who happens to live with us. So it became the intern's job to take the pizza, the final step, 25 minutes away to deliver it.
So wait, Brian became a pizza delivery guy?
Yes, Brian, in addition to being Brian the intern, is also Brian the intern pizza delivery man extraordinaire.
And let's give a shout out. For those of you who are just listening to the audio, there's also a video version of this podcast, and Brian is the one shooting it.
And he's doing a great job, we think. Obviously, we haven't seen this.
Yeah, we have no idea because we don't live in the future.
But when we do, we're going to have a big kudos for Brian.
So did you end up killing your brother?
No, I just gave him a really good rubbing and called him up and called him an idiot. I made him try and guess what it was. I told him at this outside of the call, you are the biggest idiot on earth. What do you think you did? And he started confessing all kinds of things. I did this, which honestly is great because now I have even more fuel. And then I told him about the pizza and he was like, no. Well, I guess enjoy your pizza.
So he's sad, dumb, and hungry.
Uh-huh.
That's
sad,
a bad combination.
We did take a tax from the cookie before it left. I think we all took our share of cookie.
A cookie tax. I think that's how the Revolutionary War began.
It was either that or tea, or maybe it was both.
Yeah, I don't know. The cookie tax.
So we're going to have an ongoing section here on the podcast talking about movies we've watched.
Right.
So I'm going to let you start. Why don't you tell us a film you've seen recently, what was a positive, what was something to take away, and if there was any negative or anything that was like, wasn't really so thrilled about that. Talk to me about that.
Right. Well, actually, here in the very first time we're doing this, I'm already going to cheat. Because I've been on a Frank Darabont kick recently. For those of you who don't know, he's the writer and director of The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. He has said that he is the world's most niche filmmaker because he only makes Stephen King stories set in a prison in the 30s and 40s. He's also one of the series creators of The Walking Dead. So all of you Walking Dead fanboys out there will probably appreciate that. But I, believe it or not, until very recently, had never seen The Shawshank Redemption. It was always on my list of must-watch movies that I somehow had always missed. Finally, I sat down to watch it, was absolutely blown away. And I'll get into specifics on that here in a moment. But after that, I immediately said, well, I've got to see more of what this guy's done. And for those who don't know, and we're going to get into this more in our main segment this week, but I'm a huge Stephen King fan. I had already listened to the audiobook of Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, on which the movie's based, and I knew about Frank's other work from Stephen King, The Green Mile, and I've been reading the script for that. So I've been having a kind of a, bumped the mic there, a kind of Frank Darabont double feature recently, and it's fascinating for me. I'm a big fan of latching onto filmmakers and seeing kind of their entire career, or seeing multiple projects from them and seeing how they kind of progress and seeing their similarities and stuff like that.
It's important to see that journey.
Right, and that's what's been really fun, because these are two very similar films in terms of written by the same novelist, both set in the same time period, in prisons and stuff like that, but contrasting them has been really interesting. And for me, to go back to your original question about takeaways, I mean, the Shawshank Redemption is... The biggest takeaway for me with Shawshank is not even necessarily how it was made, because it's a beautifully written, beautifully crafted, produced, incredible film. But we now think of it as a classic, right? Like, everybody says, if you haven't seen The Shawshank Redemption, you haven't lived. The funny thing is, when it came out, it wasn't successful. It didn't do well at the box office. It was kind of considered a flop. I don't even think it made its money back. It was sold to I think, like, Turner... TNT, or one of the Turner television networks, dirt cheap. It's why it's still super cheap to air on TV. It's why you see it on TV all the time. Nobody wanted this movie. Nominated for 7 Oscars, then won none of them, and yet has somehow become one of the most legendary films. It's on pretty much everybody's list of, like, greatest films of all time, and it's crazy what this movie has done to have not been a very big success in its inception. And I think it's been interesting for me, because we think about, especially today, when the box office and the first weekend is everything to a film. To look at something like Shawshank that wasn't successful and that by all accounts today would be a failure, but has since, been recognized for its quality. It's interesting, and it kind of shows how our metrics for what makes a successful film don't matter.
Well, I even think of some of the most influential films of our time, of any time. It's a Wonderful Life,
right?
Completely bombed at the box office. The Times heralded as the biggest flop Frank Capra has ever had, and today it's one of the most beloved films of all time.
Right.
The same could be said for The Princess Bride.
Yeah.
Which in the '80s was completely skewered by the critics. Nobody went to see it in theaters, and now it's a cult classic.
Right.
Fight Club's another one, completely bombed, and now it's a cult classic.
Fight Club is also, this may be an interesting discussion on a future podcast. Fight Club is very interesting because of the marketing. It was a marketing failure. It was a huge, huge mistake that whole marketing team made on that movie, which is why it bombed. But then moving on, talking about, so Shawshank and then The Green Mile. I've seen The Green Mile. It's been quite a few years. So I'm reading the script right now. I found it at a used bookstore, and I've purchased the Blu-ray. I'm gonna watch it once I'm done reading the script. But that film is so impeccably written. I mean, it's so faithful, because the original novel, for anyone who doesn't know, it was serialized, so it actually came out in small chunks over a period of months. And the screenplay itself is divided into small chunks. It feels very novelistic. It feels very, it's slower than you would normally anticipate from a film, but it's so effortlessly, beautifully crafted. And that was a film that went on to get much more acclaim in its release than Shawshank, but just incredible. And I'm really starting to appreciate Frank Darabont as a writer and as a filmmaker. And he's so smart, and he's so detail oriented, I think, is what I really appreciate about his work. So that's been really incredible to study. What about you?
So I just finished the other night with my second theatrical viewing of Inside Out.
Oh, yes.
And we went to see it together, and then I took my wife to see it a couple nights ago, and I'm just going to say, I think it's one of the Pixar's greatest films, and I think what makes it so great is story.
Yeah.
They take what is really difficult subject matter, really depression, and make it accessible.
Yeah.
They make it so that it's something that you care about and something you can actually look at. And I think the incredible thing for me is they took all of these hard concepts and all these hard constructs, and Pete Docter is a genius at this. He did the same thing in Monsters, Inc. And in Up, where you take these hard concepts, but he makes it so you can actually understand them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I really appreciated about Inside Out. On top of that, it actually is it's a very funny film. It's a heartwarming film, great for any family. But like any other Pixar film, it really isn't a children's film. It's a film for the adults, and the kids are just going to enjoy it.
Right.
So for me, Inside Out is an instant classic. It's going to be a masterpiece in my opinion.
Yeah.
As it gets a little bit further away from its release.
I think part of the genius of that movie too is the casting, because you don't have a cast that you would expect at all. Which, if you think about Pixar, they've always done. I mean, think about Tim Allen being cast in Toy Story. I mean, who would have thought of that?
Lewis Black in a children's film.
Yeah.
Nobody would call for that. I mean,
maybe Bill Hader.
Amy Poehler probably made the most sense, but even that is not your typical. When I think Amy Poehler, I don't think, oh, joy.
Right. Right.
And they did a great job. The casting was fantastic. Every element of that film is, I think, perfectly done.
Yeah.
And Pixar once again proves why they are the kings of animation.
Any particular favorite parts?
I've got a couple of favorite parts. From if you're gonna go with the feels and what made me feel the most and impacted me, I'd have to go with when Bing Bong sacrificed himself to get joy out of the hole. If you're gonna go with the funniest part, the very end, the credit sequence when they're flying into all these different people's heads. There's two particular minds that they surf into that I think I lost it. The first was the teenage boy's mind. When they go in and it's the teenage boy who's just seen the girl and they're all panicking. That is hysterical. And then when they go into the bus driver's head and it's just 5 shades of anger, all screaming at each other, holding steering wheels. For me, that was just priceless.
Well, I think that credit sequence is a perfect example of once you have set a story up perfectly, how effortlessly if you're Pixar, you can use that to get a reaction from the audience, because there's nothing explained in that credit sequence. We don't know these characters. It's nothing, it has really nothing to do with the film, but it's maybe the funniest part of the movie to me. And the abstraction sequence is also just genius.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The abstraction.
I don't remember if it was you or it might have actually been Brian. We were speaking of earlier. Brian saw it with us as well, who mentioned how that scene could have been terrible. The abstraction sequence really could have been just awful. If not done well, it could have been cliche and stupid and whatever. And it was brilliant. The way they pulled that off was just so self-referential and so smart. And I almost felt like in some ways kind of an homage to animation in a lot of ways, because they kind of step back through animation at the same time. It's just, awesome movie.
Give you the chills.
Yeah, really.
And the feels. Lots of feels in that film. If you haven't seen Up, please go see Up. It's worthwhile to see it in theaters. I don't say that for every single film.
Or Inside Out.
Sorry. Go see Inside Out. It's worthwhile to see in theaters. I don't say that for every film, but this one really is one to catch before it comes out on DVD.
And go see Up, too.
Yeah.
To be fair.
Yeah, if they're playing Up in a local theater, catch it while you can, because it won't be there long.
If they're still playing it, I want to know where your time machine is. If you still have a theater where they're playing.
One of these days we're gonna have to have a conversation about the first 15 minutes of Up, because it changed the way I viewed animation.
Get the tissues, folks.
Yeah, that is a tissues one. All right, let's move on. I want to talk. I want to kind of promo our topic for the day, which is inspirations. And you and I have each selected 3 people who have really influenced us as filmmakers, and we were going to kind of go through why those people were chosen. You've kind of already promoted who yours is, so I'm going to let you start.
All right. I'm going to start with my first is Stephen King. Stephen King, of course, a novelist, a writer, not necessarily the first person that comes to mind when you think of film, but who has had an enormous impact on film. He's had, I believe, he is the guy with the most adaptations of his work in film and television. And he's been seeing a real resurgence here in the past few years, ever since Under the Dome and Carrie and things like that. Actually, right before this podcast, I saw the news that they're looking at the director of Mama for the remake of It, because they were about to make that movie and then it fell apart at the last minute. And I mean, it's amazing to see all these things coming back. The Stand, they're doing, I think, 3 movies out of The Stand with Josh Boone, the Fault in Our Stars guy, directing it. And so he's really had a resurgence. But for me, when I was about 16, I had been writing for a while, but I started to realize that maybe it was what I wanted to do for a career. It was maybe what I wanted to do for a life. And a good friend of mine named Chase Goforth, if you're listening, Chase, hey man, He said to go check out Stephen King's book on writing, which if you haven't read it, it's part memoir and part it's not even so much a writing book as it is just his thoughts on the writer's life and what it means to be a writer. And I read that book and I was hooked. And it's like a Bible. When I'm stuck, when I'm having a problem, when I'm frustrated, I go back to that book and it drives me on. And it's actually a book that got Stephen a lot of respect from critics because he was always looked at as the horror guy and nobody could ever really look past what he did. And that book really made people realize, oh, this guy's a genius. He tells stories that are dark and bloody and, and crude and everything else, but the guy knows what he's doing and it's not by accident. And he's just a genius guy, and his impact on the craft of writing and specifically on my writing and the kind of the philosophies that I have on writing, a lot of that comes from him. And moving and kind of translating that into film, he kind of is pop culture from a certain era. When you think about movies, when you think about everything from The Shining to Misery to Carrie, and every that whole era of film, that kind of horror resurgence at that time, it's all Stephen King. And he influenced a lot of, I think, film today, because there's not a filmmaker on the planet who doesn't cite Kubrick and The Shining as at least a minor influence, and that's Stephen King. So it's really incredible what he's done, and that he's still turning out books and scripts and movies, and he's still just as active as he's ever been, and he's still, I think, if you read his newest work, he's doing some of the best work of his career.
So have I ever told you that I met Stephen King?
I believe you have, and I hate you.
Yeah, I worked for L.L. Bean for a very short period of my young life, and Stephen King lives in Maine. He's got a beautiful mansion there, and he's a very private person. He's very rarely seen in public. And so I was at work one day, and I round a corner, and now I am not as entrenched in Stephen King. I did not recognize him when I saw him. All I saw was a very scary-looking man. And he walked over to me, and he asked...
He looks like what you'd expect, right?
Well, now that I know who he is, yes.
Right.
So he's got this kind of scratchy voice when he talks. And so he walked up to me and he asks me where something is in the store. And I'm not even going to try and impersonate his voice because it would be incredibly hard to capture. But I remember being like, wow, this guy, first off, he had a confidence that you don't normally see in normal people like this. I'm actually a somebody, and you should probably know who I am confidence that I obviously didn't know who he was. And so I tell him where he needs to go, and he walks away, and a coworker walks up to me and says, do you know who that is? I said, that's somebody? They're like, that's Stephen King. Oh. And so
it all started to make sense at that
my
point.
first intro, I hadn't read, and I've read a few now, but I hadn't read any Stephen King books. I knew he wrote horror. It made a lot more sense when I saw him why he writes horror.
Well, he kind of has a famous line that he uses in interviews a lot, where he said that for years, when he would start doing interviews for his books and stuff, people would go, well, how was your childhood? And that was code for what screwed you up so bad that you write this kind of stuff. But and the other thing, and to what I was talking about earlier, he also tells a story that he was in a grocery store one day, and he came around the end of an aisle, and a woman kind of like saw him and was startled, and she went, I know who you are. You write those awful books. And he goes, well, ma'am, I also wrote The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. And she went, no, you didn't, and walked away. So I think that says something about his career.
It does. It absolutely does.
So who's your first influence?
Well, I'm going to go with the honorable mentions first. I'm going to blow out a few honorable mentions that I think could have made this list, but for one reason or another didn't quite make it. John Lasseter obviously is a major influence on any filmmaker who's studied the history of film. Right. Same goes for Disney. Those are innovators and people who've really shaken things up.
Especially for our era.
Steve Jobs and what he did to reinvent Disney and force them into a reinvention of themselves to make who they are today. I think he deserves a place in the conversation on greatest filmmaker, even though he never actually made a film. But his impact on the film industry has been insurmountable.
Which, side note, he has his own film coming out very soon.
Yes,
that I'm
which
quite excited
Sorkin
for.
wrote the script, which Sorkin's another one who was very close to making my list.
Me too. He was right there.
because of his incredible work. I think probably the greatest script he ever wrote, in my opinion, was The Social Network, which promos my first influence, which is Fincher.
Which I wanted to steal from you so bad because he was on my list too.
I know. You and I both, we talked about this beforehand for the audience, and we had a real debate about who would get to have Fincher as an influence. Ultimately, I won because my background is much more on the aesthetic and much more on the technical, and it is what a Fincher film looks like that defines who Fincher is. Fincher will work with many different writers, and while he has certain stories he gravitates towards, he's very diverse in the stories that he tells.
Yeah.
But what Fincher does is what he doesn't do.
Right.
Fincher is kind of more of a traditionalist when it comes to filmmaking. He takes things back a step. He doesn't have the Michael Bay crazy shots and a lot of things in the frame. He isolates things.
Until he does.
Yeah. But when he does, it feels like this magnificent payoff. So some of the things that would make Fincher really an influence for me is realizing that it's okay to dial things back. I can make things a little bit more simple to let it build to a point. Also understanding that what I do with the camera really does affect the audience. If you watch a Fincher film, and The Social Network is one that I think is an absolute masterpiece. It's one of my favorite films. You look at the film, the entire thing's locked down with the exception of one, maybe two shots.
Yeah.
It's locked down. It's pretty solid. I can only think there's only one shot that comes to my mind that is even handheld.
There's one handheld shot.
And when he does use that shot, it's creating this moment of out of control for the characters. Justin Timberlake is walking and he's about to be arrested, and it's a big deal in the story. And it's this moment when Mark Zuckerberg's world is kind of falling apart because he hasn't let the friendships that got him to where he was continue. He kind of let what he was doing be more important than who he was doing it with.
Right.
And that's ultimately what the whole story is about. And so at that moment, he goes to a handheld shot, and in that handheld shot, it's communicating out of control. Seven is another film that is absolutely magnificent. If you haven't seen Seven, if you're an art person or if you're a filmmaker, Seven's a film to sit down with a notepad and take notes. Watch it 3 or 4 times in a row and just take copious notes because it is a study case on filmmaking.
Right.
I'm not a huge fan of the horror genre, but this thing definitely fits in that genre and it stands above. Yeah. Everybody in there was magnificent, especially though, honestly, and I don't say this very often, Brad Pitt was magnificent in that film. Morgan Freeman, obviously, as always, gives a stellar performance, but the way that he shot it, and isolating parts of the frame and moving people to different aspects to create separation, and then bringing it all together at the end where you have that scene in the field, and the way that he shot it, creating control with the camera and letting things hang a little bit longer than you normally would to show who had the power in a shot, who had the power in a scene, really impacted me as a filmmaker in studying that, and I look forward to his future work. He's done a lot now, diversifying himself. House of Cards, obviously, is a big step for him as a filmmaker. But for me, David Fincher is my first major influence.
And just to comment from my angle of things, I think one thing that he does just brilliantly is he doesn't cast who you would expect. He puts people he takes people out of their comfort zone, and I think that's one reason Brad Pitt is so great in Seven is that he has to play a guy who's completely out of control and kind of whiny, and he's not the smooth, cool Brad Pitt that we're used to. Yeah. You know, he's not as Tyler Durden. He's not as much as like Tyler Durden. Tyler Durden feels very Brad Pitt,
and it's kind of the one thing that separates him from a David O. Russell.
Yeah.
You know, David O. Russell just dropped the new trailer for Joy that dropped a couple days ago, and
with the same cast he's been using.
It's Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro.
Right.
And he does a great job with that, but very similar as far as content directors go, but very different in that David Russell works with the same people every single time. Fincher can pull that off with different people, different actors in every single film, which is remarkable.
Right, and I would say, and I mean not to get too derailed, but I would say David O. Russell is a guy who's a genius storyteller, can't stand the way he moves a camera.
I would agree.
But still, genius.
And nobody gets a better actor, a better action out of an actor than David O. Russell.
Yeah.
Which is why his films always win the Best Actor categories.
Yeah. And I mean, and he just knows he knows the content to choose. He's very, very smart when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So for me, if we want to move on to number 2, another guy talking about performances, a guy who gets some incredible performances out of his actors and has a great relationship with his actors is Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino is a huge influence on me. I think a lot of people kind of, coming up in the era of film that I have and that I am, Tarantino is kind of, he's a legend.
So I know everybody kind of has their Tarantino film. What's your
Right.
Tarantino film?
That's a hard question. It's probably a pretty even split between Inglourious Bastards and Django Unchained.
Mm-hmm.
I love both of those films because I would say they're two of his best written.
First film you and I ever watched together was Django Unchained.
Django Unchained, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And had you seen it before that?
I hadn't. That was my first viewing of it.
I adore that film. That script is for me one of the tightest, most perfect screenplays I've ever read.
Well, what fascinated me about Django and Tarantino is what a chameleon he is as a filmmaker. He made Django feel like a chopsocky Western.
Right.
And it's a completely different style from all of his other films, but it still feels like it belongs in the same family of all his other films. And that's just not the blood and the guts, the gore. It's not all of that. It's the... I don't know.
It's the same voice. It's the same voice singing a different song. It really is. And that's one thing I respect most about him is that he doesn't just do one thing. Mm-hmm. He came out of the gate with a couple of films that were genius but similar in Res Dogs and Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown, and those are all very much in the same family. And then to completely jump ship into the Kill Bill series and then into Django, and now he's continuing with Westerns. He's recently said that he wants to make 3 Westerns.
I'm pretty excited about Hateful Eight.
I am pumped about Hateful Eight because it is modern Tarantino in terms of style, but doing what he does best, and that's putting characters in a room, making them talk, making them interact.
I feel like this is going to be Tarantino's take on 12 Angry Men.
Right, exactly. It's like 12 Angry Men meets The Magnificent Seven. Mm-hmm. Like I'm
meets
so
The Dirty
excited.
Dozen.
Right, and I really feel like I feel like this has the potential to because he's a guy who he's won some Oscars, but he's never the critics' golden boy necessarily. He's always under the kind of under fire for something. I feel like this could be a film that really adds to his lineage in a big bad way, much like Inglourious. I mean, Inglourious is one of the most technically perfect films I think I've ever seen. Yeah,
it's right up there with The Prestige for me as far as technically perfect films.
It's just, and I love I have the screenplay for that. If you haven't noticed, I'm a nerd. I read a lot of screenplays.
He reads the screenplays before he watches the movie or reads the books. So if you're wondering, should I read the book?
Right.
Listen to the audiobook, watch the movie. Cliff would say none of the above, read the script.
Right. Right. It is a different experience. Maybe that'd be something interesting to talk about in the future is kind of movie experiences in that way. But when you read the script for Inglourious, there's a introduction, and I off the top of my head, unfortunately, I can't remember who wrote that introduction, but they said that there's a line at the end of the movie, the final line of the movie is Brad Pitt's character saying, I think this might just be my masterpiece. And in the film, he's talking about a swastika that he's gouged on a Nazi's head, but the guy who wrote the introduction said, I think that's Tarantino saying it about the script. And I really think he was right.
It's a lot like Shakespeare.
Yeah.
In his final play, saying this will be my final act.
An interesting fact. I don't know if you knew this. Inglourious Basterds began as like an 800-page miniseries that was then cut back and cut back and cut back, which is why it doesn't feel like your straight up linear film because there are multiple stories going on at the same time, and the structure is kind of different from what he normally does in a film, and I think that's where it came from, and it made it so rich because he has so much detail that he knew but didn't even make it in the film, and I think that really lent to it as well. So Tarantino is a guy for me, big guy for me.
Yeah. My next one's gonna feel obvious, but I promise you it's not just because it's the obvious choice. He gets I think a lot of art people kind of look down on him, but Steven Spielberg is a major influence for me. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's just, fanboying on because he's, made all these great films. Honestly, the thing about Spielberg that for me makes him such an amazing influence is his longevity. The fact that he's been able to stay current and he doesn't just make the same film. You know, this is the same guy who made E.T., Hook, and Minority Report.
Right.
And Lincoln.
And a Schindler's List in there somewhere.
And a Schindler's List in there. And Saving Private Ryan. And honestly, the older he gets, the more respect I have for his work. I look back at Jaws, and I realized that he was a fresh start. I mean, he was fresh off of film school and had very little going for him. He had a really good short film, but not a lot that would give somebody confidence. But somebody gave him the trust to make Jaws, and Jaws is still a masterpiece.
Absolutely.
I look back, I watched Jaws today. I have the same feeling that I had when I saw it 20 years ago,
right?
And that I'm pretty sure audiences had when they saw it when it first came out. And the same goes for films like Hook and films like E.T.
Mm-hmm.
He has a way of making a film timeless.
A Jurassic Park.
A Jurassic Park. They're still making Jurassic Park films today. As of the recording of this, Jurassic World is the third highest grossing film. I guess it's actually the fourth highest grossing film of all time. Probably about to become third.
It's crazy.
It's absolutely insane. But he created those worlds, and people will forever mimic what Steven Spielberg does because Steven Spielberg did it first.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, he still does it best. You don't necessarily. I think of Tony Zhao over at Every Frame of Painting. Talked about his one shots.
Mm-hmm.
He has the ability. He created something. Not that he created the one shot, but he created a type of one shot that you don't necessarily think of as a one shot because all he's doing is weaving together individual shots, and he's just translating the distance between them. And it's very unique to him. But you'll now see a lot of people copying that and taking it into their films, and that came from Spielberg.
Yeah.
You see things like lens flares initiated with Spielberg. You see things like those types of stories where kids are really the main focus of the story. Kind of started with Spielberg and then moved into Spielberg produced films with like The Goonies and films like that. His work is broad. His work is incredible. And it still holds up today. And I'm excited about even his more recent work. Obviously, Lincoln was an incredible film. Daniel Day-Lewis. I mean, you if you're going to put Daniel Day-Lewis in a film, you're going to expect that it's going to be spectacular. And obviously, Tommy Lee Jones, I think, gave the performance of his lifetime. But Lincoln as a film was technically perfect. And then looking the trailer for Bridge of Spies.
I can't wait. I'm so excited.
It looks so classic Spielberg.
It does.
But even it feels a step above other Spielberg works. I look at it and I say, okay, that's Spielberg, but it looks better.
Yeah.
And I don't know why.
Well, the big thing that hit me on the trailer of that is his use of distorted wide angle.
Yeah,
it's
using
not something
a 16, a 14, a 12.
Yeah, I don't often when I think Spielberg, that's not my first thought. I don't think about like really wide angle stuff and a lot of distortion, but in that trailer, it's all over the place.
But I do think blues.
Right.
And I do think smoke. And I think those things. And I also saw those in the trailer. So while it is introducing these new things, it still harkened back to those old. And it's fun watching modern filmmakers trying to imitate Spielberg. Jurassic World, we went and we saw that. Did a lot that imitated a Spielberg-esque film. And so walking away, it felt Spielberg-esque, but there was something about it. It wasn't quite Spielberg.
Yeah.
So Spielberg is my second influence.
And also, to continue on that for a second, when I think of film as a piece of American culture, I think Spielberg. Mm-hmm. Spielberg is the American filmmaker.
He is.
When you think about today, we don't have what is now the kind of centerpiece of American film at this point in time with, the Avengers and the Marvel franchises and the DC franchises. You don't have those big action movies without Jurassic Park. Mm-hmm. You don't have that without. You don't have a Joss Whedon at all without Spielberg. You certainly don't have a J.J. Abrams.
Well, you don't have those epic adventure films without Indiana Jones.
Right.
Or
Spielberg's influence on Star Wars. Mm-hmm. He was right there. He was in that group. Yep. And actually, that leads me nicely into to my third is another guy who was also in that group, Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola is actually kind of a recent obsession of mine. He's a guy who's been influencing me a lot in kind of my thought in film here in the last few months. And our TV almost fell down in the background while we were recording. That's fun.
That would be bad.
Yeah, that's a nice outtake for all you guys watching on YouTube. You get to see that. If you're only listening to the audio, we just get to talk about it.
AMZG TV on YouTube. You can see it.
Yeah, that was scary. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out how I can bring that back into Coppola, and I can't do it.
He would have been just fine with the TV falling down.
Yeah, he would have left it in the shot.
Yeah, he would have left it in the shot.
Coppola's a guy, it's again, I've found myself revisiting kind of the Coppola era of film recently. It's a lot of movies that I've seen before. I'd seen the Godfather trilogy. I'd seen all that, but it had been a while, and I found myself really becoming invested in that era and that style that was created by guys like Coppola, guys like Martin Scorsese, guys like Spielberg at the time. But Coppola is just such a consummate filmmaker. When you watch The Godfather, it was a movie that he went through hell to make that film. He was not having a good time. It was a movie he made for money. It was something he was trying to keep his production company alive, and that's why he accepted the job on it. And it was just insane what went into making that thing. But he made a piece of art. In the craziest of circumstances, the most difficult of circumstances, he made an incredible piece of art that is an indelible mark on the history of film in The Godfather. It's a script. If you've never sat down and read The Godfather script, and I know I keep coming back to scripts, but it's incredible what he and Mario Puzo did, and the way he took Puzo's story and really made it visual. He made it a story told in pictures, and it's just beautiful. And then for me, one of my all-time favorite films is Apocalypse Now. Mm-hmm. Not a Coppola script. That was John Milius, but just such a rich and textured film. And it was so gutsy to do this movie right on the heels of Vietnam, to then do a movie about Vietnam that in some ways almost glorifies a little bit in some of the characters what was going on over there, and kind of lets you decide if that's right or wrong. That's so gutsy. Mm-hmm. And he's been quoted as saying that they practically went insane making that movie, and you can tell when you watch it. It is raw, visceral art, and that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, because I wish we saw more of that. I wish we saw more of films that feel crafted. I look at films today and they feel slick, and they feel super, they feel like something that was turned out. They don't feel like something that was made by hand. But you watch The Godfather, you watch Apocalypse Now, or again, Marty Scorsese, you look at like Taxi Driver. These feel like films that were crafted by an artisan. And that's been a huge influence on me.
Mm-hmm. Well, my final influence is somebody that I doubt any of our listeners have ever met or heard of. A guy by the name of Pete Shaner. Let me tell you a little about Pete. Pete and my dad grew up in the same town, and they were best friends. They back in I guess it would be the early 70s, together they directed a little short film called Supercrest. And Supercrest was this little short film about a tube of toothpaste that was Superman, and Polydent that was denture cream, and it was like this little superhero story before superhero films were a big thing. And they had a lot of fun doing that. Well, Pete went on to go to the Naval Academy. He was an officer in the Navy for several years. When he got out, he went to Hollywood. And he tried to break in. Actually ended up directing a few films. He was a military advisor on several films. A Few Good Men is one of them with Tom Cruise. And
Aaron Sorkin again, to bring that back around.
Yes, so he was on a nice Aaron Sorkin. It really is sad Aaron Sorkin didn't make our list. If Mr. Sorkin, if you're listening, we have the utmost respect, and if you just let us know, we'll bump somebody off our list to put you on. Just let us know who you want off.
I'm getting in line now for Steve Jobs, Aaron. So
yes, we are already. We're recording this podcast while in line.
Okay, this is a total derail. We should record this from the line to see Star Wars 7.
Yes.
Sorry, continue.
Okay, so Pete ended up directing a couple of films, one called Lover's Knot. He did a couple of films called Shoot Fighter. They were horrible films, and not well received. But Pete was special to me because when I first expressed an interest in this, he was the first person to say, "Hey, you could do that." I did not come from a family that was very artsy. In fact, when I started showing any interest in the arts, my family was kind of like, "That's nice. Why don't you think about, a job and you can kind of do this on the side? Yeah, that'll be nice." Right. And in fact, when I went to school originally, I went to school studying communications with a focus in speech and organizational management, because I had been convinced that you can't make a living in this field. And Pete was the first person that really told me you can. And you should follow your dream, and you should work hard. And yes, there's commonly known as two ways to break into this industry. Either you are super talented or you know somebody. And Pete was the first person that convinced me there's actually a third way, and that's to work really, really hard. Because if you work really, really hard, you can become that person who's super talented.
Right.
And so Pete convinced me to work really, really hard, because I saw him do it. I saw him every day, working on things that I know he knew were never going to be successful. He knew it was never going to be seen by an audience, but he loved it. And he worked and worked and worked. And for me, that commitment to your dream, that commitment to doing something all the way was a major influence on who I am today as a filmmaker. I still have conversations with Pete from time to time. We saw him just a little bit ago. We were talking about just some concept ideas for feature films that we're getting ready to start working on. And he's kind of still my when I have a question or when I have a doubt about myself as a filmmaker, I call it Pete.
He's your guru.
He is. He's the God who lives on a hill. He may never have had a box office success, but he's still done it. He's been there. He's done that, and he's my mentor.
That's awesome.
So for me, Pete Shaner is that final influence in my life.
That's awesome, and I can't think of a better note to end on.
Yeah. So for those of you who are watching the podcast on AMZG TV, feel free to download this on the iTunes store.
Right.
We are on iTunes now.
Yes, and be sure to give us a rating.
Yes.
iTunes ratings actually mean quite a bit to podcasts.
They do. So give us a 5-star, unless you dislike it, in which case give us a 4-star. And for those of you who are listening on iTunes now, we have a channel. Go to AMZG TV. You can see some of our more. You can obviously see the podcast there. We also have some of our more fun work. Some little things that we do inside the studio, some pet projects. It's kind of our little channel for our personal humor.
Right.
So a great place to go and get to know us better and see some of the behind the scenes of some of the projects that we're currently working on. You can also check out our website, amazingstudiosinc.com.
Yep.
There's great resources there, great way to see kind of some of our directorial work, our writing work, our editing work. That's really where our high-end client work goes.
Right. You can also follow us personally if for some reason this isn't enough of us. For me, you can follow me on Twitter at Cliff Bumgardner.
And I'm still working on a good way to follow me. I have a Twitter, and I work so much in social media that I never post personal things. So you can follow me on my Twitter. It's at Peter Scheibner. However, don't expect me to tweet anything for a while. I'm working on figuring out what the best way for me to engage with the audience is as we move down the road. So more on that. Stay tuned.
So what you're saying is just follow me.
Follow Cliff. And also, secondarily, follow me.
All right, guys. Well, we hope you have a good week. We will be back next week with a new topic and more info on production. Again, if you have any comments, you have something you want to see on the show, hit us up in any of those networks we mentioned, and we'll try to address it. We're looking forward to getting into this with everyone who listens to it. So,
from Cliff and I and everybody here at Amazing Studios, thank you so much for listening.
Have a good week.
Bye.